Welcome to Brother Miller's Notes. I'm so glad you're with me today as we study the book of Galatians. Paul uses some awesome phrases in the book of Galatians, and really most of them are focused on, well, I can say all of them, on staying true in times of difficulty. He gives advice. Here's how to stay on the covenant path. He talks about walking in that path while walking in the Spirit and the fruits of the Spirit. And he's kind of summarizes with, look, one day we're going to reap the things that we sow. So let's just stay on the covenant path and keep together. So that's kind of an overview of the book of Galatians. Now, Galatia is in modern day Turkey. Time frame when Paul writes this letter, just going back, you have Paul's first ministry, the first missionary labor. And that happens about 45 AD, and I got little stars up on this little chronology. At that time, you have people who often are called Judaizers. They're like, hey, if you want to be Christian, that's great, but you got to become a Jew first. You got to convert to Judaism, and then that's the pathway to Christianity. And so Paul will start talking about that in a lot of his letters, and it's a central theme in the book of Galatians. So you have Paul's first missionary experience, Paul's second, about 50 AD, 49, 50, goes back to Jerusalem, starts his third mission, 53, 54 AD, and then Galatians is a kind of sandwiched in between 1st and 2nd Corinthians and Romans. Now, the book of Galatians, when Paul writes it and he is, it's passionate. That's the best way you can describe the way he writes this. And he's very concerned that many of the saints, when he was working with them, when he was on his mission, they were firm and faithful in the gospel. And now they're straying from the gospel. And he's emotional about it. And a lot of it is as a result of these people who are the Judaizers. It's, hey, yeah, you're walking out the Spirit, but you got to go back and be part of the law of Moses and get back to your roots. And they're actively going after the converts that Paul's helped to convert to the gospel. So you can kind of see his passion at the end of the letter. It doesn't come through very well in the King James Version of the Bible. Galatians 6 verse 11 says, "You see how large a letter I've written unto you with mine own hand." Now, you think Galatians isn't that big. It's not that thick. It's not, 1 Corinthians. It's not 2 Corinthians. How large a letter. But other translations have it just a little different. Now, the NLT, different translation. Notice what large letters I use writing these closing words in my own writing. All caps. I'm texting you in all caps. RSV, a different version. See what large letters I'm writing to you with my own hand. I'm passionate about this, and you got to know it, not only from the way I'm saying it, but how I'm writing it. I want you people in Galatia or modern day Turkey, to understand. And the main thing he's upset with is these were wonderful converts. They had the Spirit with them. They knew that Jesus was the Christ. They've been converted. And there's been an outside influence that's influencing them to walk away. And I thought maybe of all of Paul's letters, one of the ones that is the most relevant to us today, the most applicable to us today, is the book of Galatians. So maybe we'll put Galatians and teach the whole thing in the context of one summary, one kind of a, hey, think about. Think about, you see a popular video or a post being shared by many of your friends on social media. It contains ideas that oppose what you've been taught at home and in the church. What do you do? What do you click on? How do you respond? Do you just silent? Do you do okay, I like you as a person, so I'm going to give you a like emoji? Do you keep following what they're teaching on social media? Well, that's Galatians 1. I marvel, verse 6, that you are so removed from him that called you into the grace of Christ unto another gospel. I'm amazed you're listening to other voices and have stepped away from what I've taught you. Okay, verse 7, which is not another gospel, but there is some that trouble you. There are people who are actively working to undermine your faith, trouble your faith, and pervert the gospel of Jesus Christ. That is the whole theme of Galatians. And then Paul says, I've got advice for you. So as I go through this today, it's really focusing on the advice that Paul has for people who are actively influencing them to step away, to turn away from the gospel of Jesus Christ, turn away from the truths that you've been taught, and follow some other advice. And Paul says, okay, you want to stay converted? You want to stay on the covenant path? Here's how you do it. And he starts off, you got to know, you got to have faith that God can deliver us from this present evil world. With God, these things are possible. And then he has a focus that you receive truth, not by what's popular, by majority, but by revelation from God. And that's a major theme throughout the entire book of Galatians. We start with it, we end with it in chapters 5 and 6. And it's also been a major theme of President Russell M. Nelson. In this first public address, big address, as the prophet, he's focused on revelation. He said we live in a world that is complex and increasingly contentious. The constant availability of social media and a 24-hour news cycle bombard us with relentless messages. If we are to have any hope of sifting through the myriad of voices and the philosophies of men that attack truth, we must learn to receive revelation. But in the coming days, it will not be possible to survive spiritually without the guiding, directing, comforting, and constant influence of the Holy Ghost. My beloved brothers and sisters, I plead with you to increase your spiritual capacity to receive revelation. So Paul focuses, truth is received by revelation. And that truth helps convert you to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And he uses that word, converted. I was converted. I had to be converted. You were converted. And when you're doing things, don't do things to please people that are maybe those other influences. Verse 15, do things that please God. And he says, not for somebody who thinks they're all that. In Paul's words, he says, but of these who seem to be somewhat, or we'd say, hey, for these people who seem to be popular, who seem to be all that, and then in parentheses, whatsoever they were, it maketh no matter to me. I don't care who they are, what their credentials are, how many followers they have. God accepteth no man's person. They seem to be somewhat in conference, add nothing to me. Now, part of it, he's going to refer to some specific people here, but he's really just saying God doesn't take into account human credentials. Do things that matter to God. Don't try and please somebody who thinks that they're all that or very popular. But then he also says, sometimes people who are around you and who are leaders, and he calls them pillars of the church, sometimes they do things that you may not appreciate. And for him, the background is after the Jerusalem conference, where they decide, hey, you don't have to become Jewish, you don't have to be circumcised to become a Christian. You're Christian. And then Peter does some things that appears that his actions, what he does, not what he says, but his actions imply that maybe he is supporting this other group. And maybe they were. Peter's not perfect, but neither are you and I, neither is Paul. But there's a principle that is taught. It's okay to disagree, but don't be disagreeable. Now, Paul's passionate when he writes this, and he tells maybe some things that, I don't know, maybe if he had a second chance, he might not have written. But he just says, hey, I had some things against Peter, and when Peter came to Antioch, chapter 2, verse 11, I withstood him to the face. I got in his face, toe to toe, face to face, and I told him what was what. Could have Paul been right? Yeah. Could there have been other reasons why Peter was doing what he was doing? Yeah. I love the way one modern scholar illustrated the point. He did it in this way. No doubt Peter had his side of the story. Fear may have been his motive, and Paul may have acted prematurely. Paul admits that the mission of the pillars was to the Jews. That's, Peter was one of those pillars. If intense Jewish converts reacted negatively to the Jerusalem Council decision, James and Peter may have sought a transition delay to convince the stubborn. If Peter labored to bring this about, Paul may have pushed conformity to the council's ruling ahead of its time. Paul evidently retold the story because the Judaizers used the episode to give the impression that Peter agreed with them. The incident is instructive in showing two strong leaders agreeing on a principle that came by revelation but applying the principle with different timing. Paul does not say that Peter prematurely separated himself from the Gentiles. These candid examples show how revelation came after deep searching. Paul reviewed these examples, of course, to show that church leaders stood with him in teaching salvation through the revealed gospel, not through the Mosaic law. And recently, we have this exact same example, whether it's the scholar illustrating it or Peter having an illustration with Paul, with President Russell M. Nelson. There have been times where he has disagreed with his counselors, Dallin H. Oakes and President Eyring. But I love the way he's explained it and talked about those disagreements in a recent, I think this is a Facebook post. He posted this, and this is August 1st. Differences of opinion are a part of life. I work daily with people who sometimes see an issue differently. My two noble counselors, Dallin H. Oakes and Henry B. Eyring, have taught me how to disagree in a Christ-like way. Over the last 5 years of working together, we haven't always agreed. Still, they know I want to hear their honest feelings about everything we discuss, especially sensitive issues. From their examples, I have learned 6 ways to disagree. Express feelings with love. Don't think you know best. Don't compete. Don't rigorously defend your position. Let the Spirit guide your conversations. Be filled with charity, the pure love of Christ. Charity is the antidote to contention. It is the principal characteristic of a true follower of Jesus Christ. Charity defines a peacemaker. So maybe kind of in summary of what Paul's experience with the scholar or President Nelson's example, it's okay to disagree, but don't be disagreeable. And you have to be aware, Paul's saying, that there are people out there that want to bewitch you. And their purpose is not altruistic. They're wanting to bewitch you, that's his words, bewitch you, so that you don't obey the truth. So that's chapter 3, verse 1. O foolish Galatians, who hath bewitched you? Now that term bewitched means to speak ill of someone, to slander someone, to badmouth them. Who's been badmouthing? And for him, Paul the apostle, the apostles, the leaders, those missionaries who came, they're bewitching you in the next verse, or next part of that verse, that ye should not obey the truth. They're actively trying to influence you to step away or walk away from what God has revealed through his prophets and apostles. And then verse 2, this only I would learn. I only want to know one thing. When you receive the Spirit, did you get it by the works of the law of Moses? Or by the hearing of faith? When you heard the word of Christ, when you heard the gospel, did you feel it? Did you feel that peace? Did your faith increase? Is that how you receive the Spirit? Are you getting it by the gospel? Or are you getting it by those who are actively trying to tear you down? And then he says, are you so foolish? Verse 3. You began in the Spirit. Are you going to turn from it? Or in other words, kind of verse 4, have you suffered so many things in vain? Now, maybe for me, the way it rephrases this question is, are all of your past positive spiritual experiences of no significance to you? That when you're faced with the option of continuing in the Spirit or turning to the voice of slander, that you turn to the voice of slander. What are you going to do? Continue in the Spirit or turn to the voice of slander? Which one makes you feel at peace? And we're going to get there in chapter 5. So, hey, there's people who want to bewitch you, but past spiritual experiences can be an anchor in times of bewitching. And then Paul says, let me give you a little bit more advice to stay on the covenant path. And really, the next 2 chapters, it's just focus on fundamental principles and covenants. He talks about the Abrahamic covenant. He spends a chapter on it. We're blessed through the Abrahamic covenant. And there's the law of Moses. It had a purpose. Its whole purpose was to bring us to Christ. Now, today we'd use an example of maybe training wheels. You could ask, put a picture up. What's the purpose of training wheels? I mean, why do you take them off? I mean, if it was so good for you when you were young, or maybe a little bit older, what's its purpose? Why do you take them off? Paul uses a little bit different example. Wherefore the law, and that's chapter 3, verse 23, the law was our schoolmaster. A schoolmaster back then was a trusted servant who oversaw the student. Personal kind of tutor, but it's not just, hey, what are they going to know up here? But it's their overall education, their overall becoming, their overall being. It's becoming a complete person. That's the schoolmaster. Was the law of Moses your schoolmaster? Was that your training wheels to bring us to Christ? Yeah, it is. For Paul, the law of Moses brings us to Christ. And then verse 25, after you got that faith in Christ, we no longer need the training wheels. We no longer need the schoolmaster. For verse 26, conclusion, you are all children of God by faith in Jesus Christ, or Christ Jesus. So he's just pointing out, hey, you're a child of God. Everything that the law of Moses brings us to Christ. And when you know you're a child of God, you have that yearning to communicate with him. So you get Galatians 4, verse 5, and because ye are sons and daughters, God has sent forth the Spirit of his Son into your hearts, crying, Abba, Daddy, Father. You're no longer a servant, but you're a daughter. You're a son. And if you're a daughter, then you're an heir of God through Jesus Christ. So not only are you a child of God, but you are children of the promise that extended to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, I took this picture and probably shouldn't show it on public, but here it is anyway. And you look at the picture and what stands out to you. I think this is the favorite picture that my wife had me take in the month of June. But I'm just going to point out one thing from the picture. You can probably see a lot of things. You have 4 individuals seated down by a table, which is over with cloth, white cloth. And maybe you know the context of this. This is a beginning of a sacrament meeting. But I'm looking at the shoes. Yet the young man on the left, he's in sandals. You got the kind of working boots. Third one, you got the brown church shoes. You got the fourth, the one on the right, in tennis shoes. And, okay, I love kind of the symbolism, what Paul teaches, because chapter 5 is, there's an invitation. It doesn't matter what type of shoes you have on. Christ invites us through covenants to walk in the Spirit. We walk the covenant path. And he says, hey, even when you're on the covenant path, chapter 5 is just this imagery, it's tug of war. And sometimes our lives are like a tug of war. And he starts bringing out some of the one side of the tug on your heart. And it's Galatians chapter 5, verses 19, 20, 21. And the works of the flesh are manifest, which are adultery, fornication, any type of sexual desires that shouldn't be there, premarital sex, uncleanliness, lasciviousness. And I always have to, hey, if we can't pronounce it very well, I'm not sure I know what it means. Lasciviousness, unbridled lust. Okay, idolatry, witchcraft. And as a side note, witchcraft, we'll get more into this when we get into the book of Revelations, that comes from the Greek word pharmakeia, pharmacy, illicit use of drugs. Okay, hatred, variance, emulations, you got the envy there, wrath, strife, seditions, heresies, envyings, murders, drunkenness, revelings, the party. I'm going to party like it's 1999. And of such like. It doesn't really matter. Here's what's pulling you. Here's the tugs on one side, but then you have the tugs on the other. God is offering us the Spirit, the peace. And in this tug life, you get a different, feeling's not the right word. Sometimes you try and describe the Spirit as a feeling. No, it's the Spirit communicating with you. So for Paul, it's the fruit of the Spirit. Here's how you are when you're feeling the influences of the Spirit. Love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance. And it's that constant tug. You feel at peace when you're following the covenant path. And how do you feel when you have a hatred? When you're nurturing a grudge. When you're mad, you're fighting, you're envying somebody else. How do you feel? Okay, when you're feeling the influence of the Spirit on you, there's the other tug. And one of the greatest, maybe cross-references would be 1 Nephi chapter 8, and get it in 1 Nephi 11 with Nephi. But Father Lehi's dream. And just that reminder, you show a picture. All right, the fruit of the Spirit. How does that relate to 1 Nephi chapter 8? What was the fruit? What did it represent? And when Father Lehi tasted it, how do you describe the fruit? Sweet. Above everything else, it was sweet. More delightful. Anything else was delightful. He uses all these words. And then he just wants his family to also partake and have this joy in their lives. That's the fruit. That's 1 Nephi 11. That's or 1 Nephi 8, 1 Nephi 11. And the very end of Alma chapter 32. The fruit of the Spirit going to take root in your heart. And there's a product of the fruit, of this seed which is planted in our hearts. And sometimes Paul just wants these Galatians to know you had that seed, you felt that joy, you felt that peace, you felt that love, and then you got a test, and some of you walked away. Elder Packer said this several years ago. At your baptism and confirmation, you took hold of the iron rod, but you are never safe. It is after you've partaken of that fruit that your test will come. So for Paul, it's just really simple. If we live by the Spirit, let's walk by the Spirit. And then he wants to kind of like, okay, I'm going to teach the same thing in a way, but do it another way. And he starts talking about planting and harvesting and just uses these phrases that people would know about in an agricultural society. Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. If you plant it, the harvest will always come. Okay? But you harvest what you plant. The harvest might not be very big. And maybe there's lots of droughts and exceptions, right? But what you harvest is what you planted. Stephen R. Covey has this great quote that maybe applies this to today, to me, to you. That idea of what you sow, what you plant, you reap. Sow a thought, reap an action. Sow an action, reap a habit. Sow a habit, reap a character. Sow a character, reap a destiny. Where Spencer W. Kimball added in the word eternal, reap an eternal destiny. So Galatians 6 verse 8, for he that soweth to his flesh shall reap of the flesh corruption. He that soweth to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting. Let us not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap, if we faint not. Elder Soares kind of summarized these verses 8 and 9 and taught it this way. To sow in the Spirit means that all of our thoughts, words, and actions must elevate us to the level of divinity of our heavenly parents. However, the Scriptures refer to the flesh as the physical or carnal nature of the natural man, which allows people to be influenced by passion, desires, appetites, and drives the flesh instead of looking for inspiration from the Holy Ghost. If we're not careful, these influences together with the pressure of the evil in the world may conduct us to adopt vulgar and reckless behavior, which may become part of our character. In order to avoid those bad influences, we have to follow what the Lord instructed the prophet Joseph Smith about continuously sowing in the Spirit. Wherefore, be not weary in well-doing, for ye are laying at the foundation of a great work, and out of small things proceedeth that which is good. For me, the book of Galatians can be taught with 3 words. They are start, stop, continue. Because Paul uses so many phrases that could help someone today, wherever they are on the covenant path, just starting it, holding on with both hands to the iron rod, maybe holding on with one hand, maybe looking to take a step away or a step back. What do you need to start doing today? What do you need to stop doing today? What do you need to continue doing today? That, for Paul, the phrases that'll help you walk in the Spirit, that will bring you the fruits of the Spirit, that will help you. I mean, right now, what are you going to start doing knowing that you're going to reap what you're sowing today? What are you going to start doing or stop doing or continue doing that helps you stay on the covenant path? Or with President Nelson, his invitation, what are you going to start doing, stop doing, or continue doing that'll help increase your spiritual capacity to receive revelation? Thanks for spending some little time with me as we've talked about studying the book of Galatians. Have a wonderful day. Keep smiling.